So, first of all, I'd like to introduce my old friend, sometimes combatant, Professor Harold Goodwin, the father of responsible tourism. I think I can call you that, Harold, the father of responsible tourism, and the man who has done more, I think, than anybody else to put this issue into the international agenda. Welcome, Harold.
That's very kind, Geoffrey. I mean, I would just remind everybody about the work that Josh Krippendorf had done, and he probably first used that concept. But I guess it's true that I've pushed it forward and been working at it for 20 odd years.
Yeah, and you've done a great job in in an area where it's been challenging because basically you've been playing in the NGO land and you've had to fight for support and you've had to fight for the tenets of what you've created in an important concept of changing mindsets around how tourism should operate. So, for that reason, I think we should all be grateful to you, Harold.
Well, that's very kind. I've had the luxury, I suppose, in a way, Geoffrey, of working in the university system for the last 20 odd years. And that does produce what used to produce a degree of freedom to pursue particular interests. And, I've had the luxury of teaching a lot of postgraduate students on master's courses, some of whom are really making a big difference in the world now.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I came across two of your students recently in the Gambia with
Oh, that would be Lucy and Adam Abar, I guess.
absolutely, and the first thing they talked about is what they'd learned from you and how they were putting that into practice. And this is the important thing. I mean, the academic world is one thing, Harold. You've been very active in this world, and I've played on the edges of it. But it's putting the academic stuff into practice, which I think is where you have been at your most successful.
Yes, I mean, I'm quite depressed by what's happening in academia with people beavering away writing papers for journals that nobody can afford to buy and nobody reads. It does seem to me we've really slipped into isolating academic work from practitioners, either in industry, in government, or worse, in communities where they really need help to work out how to solve some of these problems.
Well, and I think that takes us to the subject of this discussion between us, which is the Horizon paper that you produced for the TPCC last year, the Tourism Panel on Climate Change, and which is focused on helping to change the paradigm around the way tourism operates in the general economic sphere. I think I can put it that way in terms of your Horizon paper. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the Horizon paper, why it's relevant for tourism decision makers, and a little bit of your thinking of how you would see this moving from just being another paper to something that's actually implemented at the destination level.
Sure, happy to do that.
So with that, I'm going to ask you four questions today, and we're going to listen to you, and we might have an exchange about it afterwards. But mostly, Harold, it's to get your thoughts out there in the public domain. So the first question is, what's in this Horizon paper? What's donut economics, and why is it, what's in the paper?
Well, Geoffrey, can I first of all say how pleased I was to be asked to write it? I thought nobody would ever ask me to do that particular paper. It's it starts for me. It starts with my memory as a 16-year-old of that 1968 photograph of Earthrise taken by one of the Apollo missions. And we seem rather foolishly, I think, to have forgotten that. We are, after all, spaceship Earth. And that kind of language was quite common in the 60s and then in the early 70s. But we've slowly chosen to forget that, despite the fact that whilst I've been alive, the Earth's population has grown by several billion, and we pumped an awful lot of carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere, all of which, as we've known actually since the middle of the 19th century, was going to cause climate change through global warming. So it starts with that. It then goes on to talk about why just mouthing words about sustainability and climate resilience really won't make the difference unless people take responsibility and change their behavior, abandon business as usual. Then we just continue. And Geoffrey, I am more pessimistic than you are because I look at the graph of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and I don't see us denting that graph. It continues. And the carbon dioxide hangs around for a long time. There's an awful lot of climate change now embedded in the system. In part 3 of the book, of the paper rather, what I do is go through Kate Raworth's Don't Economics, looking at her 7 ways of rethinking economics for the 21st century and applying that to travel and tourism. And then in the final part, I look at what the implications are of that thinking. And basically what she's saying is that we live in a finite world, that we are in some areas already exceeding the ability of our planet to sustain the Earth's population. And that applies to travel and tourism as much as it does to any other sector. And just quickly, the point I'd want to make, Geoffrey, is that in 2015, when over-tourism shot to the front of the international agenda around the municipal elections in Barcelona, we were really the first sector to see the problems of the limited planet hit the industry hard. And Barcelona was one of the first to start to deal with over-tourism, but a lot of destinations are now addressing the problems of over-tourism. It's just one example of the problems of tourism in a finite world.
So if I can kind of interpret that, what you're saying is the tourism industry has been based on a continual growth syndrome, if you like. All of our data, all of our policy papers, it doesn't matter whether it comes from government or whether it comes from the industry, and we've been used to a time of continuing growth. And if I'm interpreting you correctly, you're suggesting in the Horizon paper that donut economics says you have to start looking at the boundaries, going back very much to the 1972 Club of Rome thinking that there are limits to a continuous growth scenario.
Geoffrey, presumably, like me, you've got a copy of the 1972 Club of Rome report. And I discovered it. I was at university at the time doing international politics. You might have thought it would have come up in my university course, but of course it didn't. But it was on the front page of the Sunday Times. You may remember that, Geoffrey. So I wrote off and got sent a copy. And I read it and thought, this is just nonsense. The human species will never be that stupid. Guess what? We were. We paid no attention. And the forecasts which were made then, some work being done by the Sustainability Institute in Melbourne, which demonstrates that most of those forecasts turned out to be right. And it's the same with the IPCC forecasts. Most of those are turning out to be either an understatement or correct. So I think we've been really slow to see the issues that confront us, and we procrastinated for way too long. The reality now, you won't have seen this, Geoffrey, because I was slightly surprised to see it. Daily Telegraph yesterday, that radical left-wing newspaper, has an article about 7 ways that climate change will alter your holidays by 2050. You'll be holidaying in Northern Europe and probably not in the summer because it will be too hot to go on holiday. City breaks will be hot. They may be leafier because a lot of cities are putting in trees to try and cool the climate. We'll value underwater tourism. And travel insurance is going to get a hell of a lot more expensive because it's going to become a lot more hazardous because of climate change. Now, what's interesting is there's more awareness in the broadsheets and the papers than there is in the travel trade press, or apparently amongst academics. The issue is coming forward. One of the things they say in the Telegraph article is that Britain will become a leading venue or destination for wine tourism. And there's a personal link in that for me, Geoffrey, because I first began to be really seriously worried about climate change when I discovered that French vineyards were digging up their vines and moving them up further up the mountains to get to cooler soils in order to ensure productivity. And it's things like that that people need to recognize. And one of the problems, I think, is now we have too few gardeners and too few people who are actually involved with what's happening in the living world that understand the scale of what's happening. We're getting great bird species variety now in Kent because of climate change. The species are moving north. It's great in that sense. But what it means for us in terms of our sustainability in this part of Kent is a different matter.
Well, you've moved me nicely into the second question. I probably wouldn't have read the stuff on the front page of the Times when at most stages of my life, Harold. I was probably looking at the back pages of the Sun, I'm afraid.
As long as it wasn't page 3, Geoffrey.
Exactly. Well, I probably was looking at that as well. Yeah, the tourism sector seems to be talking about change. How in your mind do you think the donut economics thinking and boundaries to a whole range of human activity, how do you think tourism needs to respond, and how do you think it kind of impacts on tourism?
Geoffrey, I don't think this interview is long enough. I mean, the reality is that what operators need to do is to look at the major causes of the emissions which are causing climate change. Now, the reality is that most of it actually comes from the international air travel, and what many operators are now doing is costing their tours from the arrival airport and taking the aviation bit out of it. What was interesting for me was that when at WTM London this year, I put on a panel of largely engineers, and most of them female, from Airbus, from Rolls-Royce. The audience, which had been packed, about a third of them left when the aviation question came up. And I think a lot of people have just, a bit like rabbits in the headlights, they've just assumed that nothing can be done about aviation. As far from the truth. We will, I believe, by the mid-30s have hydrogen-powered aviation, which is vital for the future of the travel and tourism industry, not maybe for Britain, but certainly for the Gambia, all those islands in the Caribbean who are now dependent on tourism. I'm optimistic about the future. But what we need is, instead of messing about with cooking oil and trying to grow maize and turn it into aviation fuel, we need to face the facts that we need to move as rapidly as possible to hydrogen. And that will solve a big part of the carbon impact. Hotels, similarly, can do a great deal to reduce their carbon emissions, but they need to crack on and do it. And there's a lot of talk about sustainability, but there isn't enough action.
Yeah, I sure, like me, you smiled wryly when you saw what happened with Booking.com and the fact that they've now had to sort of take down all of their green promotion because courts are starting to say, hey, this is not for real. And I'm with you on this. I think it's time that the industry did take the climate issue absolutely seriously. I think Airbus is certainly looking to put a hydrogen-powered aircraft into play in the mid-30s. Would that be? I think they said.
Well, they're still saying 2035, Geoffrey. And
yeah.
when you actually meet the engineers who are saying that and you look them in the eye, you can see that they believe it. And I've got a clip of an interview with the guy who developed the most successful Rolls-Royce engine, in which he talks passionately about how engineers exist to solve problems. There's no law of nature that means you can't fly with hydrogen. And he then starts talking passionately about why tourism matters to the world and that we can't get into a situation where people can't fly. Now, the industry, the aviation industry in particular, will often just assume that it will be allowed to go on flying because everybody likes it so much. But what is it, about 2% of the world's population flies in any one year?
Yeah,
And we've already seen airlines being denied slots at airports as they reduce them. I mean, I think they're just flying blind in a way, hoping the problem will go away. And it isn't going to go away. It's going to get worse. And there'll have to be a political response to that.
Look, in reality, we've got 7 years to 2030, one of the targets in the UN system, and we've got almost 30 years to 2050. These are very smart guys in the airlines and in the aircraft manufacturers. I think they've got to turn their attention to meeting the kind of targets that the IPCC was calling for. Peaking emissions in 2025, nobody's doing that. Halving them in 2030 and having zero, not net zero, but zero emissions in 2050. And I'm absolutely sure you're right, Harold. The hydrogen seems to be the big thing where we can make a major breakthrough. But
it is. But we need to see more progress in the hotels, in the accommodation sector. On the cars, I think we'll see progress because it's changing at the national level. So that element of the tourism emissions will probably be significantly reduced by the fact that our car sector in travel and tourism is part of the car economy in the destinations we travel to. So I'm not so worried about that. I think that will to some extent be dealt with. Hotels, to be honest, I mean, and I want to be brutal about this, hotels aren't much more than office blocks with a few more bathrooms in them. And the same rules which are going to apply to offices are going to be applied to hotels. We're already beginning to see that in some jurisdictions. But of course, the travel and tourism industry prefers to do everything itself, doesn't like to look outside the silo, and doesn't recognize what's happening elsewhere. One of the people I worked with on the Pro-Port tourism papers, Caroline Ashley, is now working for an NGO called Steelwatch, and they're looking at using hydrogen to make steel. And we're already making steel from hydrogen in the Scandinavian countries. It's going to come. But we carry on hoping that we'll be able to do business as usual because we believe our own propaganda about how important we are. We're 10% of the world economy, I'm told. I think it's more accurate to say that we're 10% of world consumption and we're consuming too much. And if it's a choice between putting bread on the table or having a holiday, the bread on the table is going to win out and the holiday sector will be reduced.
yeah, I think the dangers are the projections. I think at the moment, the greenhouse gas impact of tourism generally and of aviation specifically is still in the 8 to 10%. That was the figure that the TPCC honed in on, 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas. But on the projections, it's going to rise to something closer to 20% using current projections, maybe more. And
Geoffrey, sorry to interrupt, but
okay, go on.
Absolutely right. But the reason, sorry to interrupt, but the reason I wanted to interrupt is to say that is in a significant part because in travel and tourism, we don't look at what's happening in other sectors. And in some other sectors, carbon emissions are really being reduced. China now has a train running on hydrogen. Aberdeen runs its buses on hydrogen. The German truck manufacturers are using flasks of hydrogen. They've reduced the refueling time dramatically to increase efficiency by transferring to hydrogen. These things are happening outside of our sector, but we go on blindly believing that the airlines will continue to operate as they have. EasyJet, very sensibly, is working closely with Airbus and Rolls-Royce and a number of other engineering companies to develop hydrogen-based aviation. It's going to arrive mid-30s.
Yeah, I think for too long, we've had this historical exception.
Yes.
Whether it's on taxation, whether it's on the fact that aviation is seen as a special sector, dealt with outside the general framework of the UNFCCC inside an aviation supportive framework, which is all a positive development, but we're coming up against a crunch period now. And I think you and I are both saying the same thing. It can't continue that way because if it's 20% of greenhouse gas and there's billions this is the projection for 2050, more than 1 billion climate refugees. You know, the young people who do get this, they're not going to stand for this. They're going to be there's going to be much more activism in the streets than we're even seeing now. So if the industry was smart, it would say we've got 7 years to hit the 2030 targets. Let's get serious about it now. And we've got nearly 30 years, 25 years to hit the 1.5 target. And if we are flying aircraft at that stage, which are polluting, they should come out of the skies. They should not be able to operate. And I think if they had that kind of imperative behind them, they might be a little more responsive.
I think that's right, Geoffrey. What I mean, one clutches at straws in a way for optimism at the moment, but the fact that the 747s have largely gone out of service and not been sold on and are sort of mouldering in the desert is a good omen for the future, because my fear was that those 747s would start to operate somewhere else. I think what happens to the scrapped planes in the future will be interesting. Airbus is currently apparently building planes which can be transitioned to hydrogen. So they won't have the scale of problem that Boeing's got. But frankly, the way things are going for Boeing, you wonder if they'll still be in business. I just wanted to remind us, though, as well, Geoffrey, the big thing we don't talk about, which is the consequences of climate change for disease. So I live in Faversham in Kent, as you well know. I'm on the edge of the marsh. In the 30s, we had something called marsh fever, which is a kind of malaria, less serious than the kind you get in Africa, but nonetheless that. And of course, in Brazil at the moment, there's an absolute epidemic of dengue fever, which is an extremely unpleasant consequence, surely at least in part a consequence of climate change. And I think we're kind of ignoring both the flood and drought and the disease dimensions of this, all of which will hit tourism as well.
So you would see, and I would agree with you on that, Harold. I've read also that in the Siberian tundra, there's a great fear of releasing new kinds of viruses, which will have a similar effect to COVID. And
Yes.
we're not prepared for them.
No, and also
So
because you mentioned the tundra, Geoffrey, the other big fear is that climate change and melting ice in those kinds of environments will result in methane coming to the surface, and even if it just goes up as methane, it's a problem. If it catches fire, it will be producing CO2, which hangs around for longer. So it's a whole series of elements of this which are likely to accelerate the pace of change. And for me now, I know you still see primarily a climate change crisis. I think I increasingly see a polycrisis, that we've got a series of interlocking problems which over food supply, over migration, over war as a consequence of this. I mean, let's face it, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. That, of course, is hardly ever talked about, but that may not be unrelated to why Russia might quite like to have some control over Ukraine again. A lot of this is going to be conflict over access to natural resources, and particularly to food and water.
well, I don't disagree with you about the polycrisis. I think my angle on it would be, of the various crises that are emerging, it's the climate one which is on its own right existential, and that's why we've put so much focus on it at Sunex. But I share your view.
Geoffrey, I'm not criticising that position. I think it's entirely right. But what I want people to understand is that climate crisis is also adding to the other elements of the crisis, which then increase the magnitude of the food crisis. I mean, you look at, I don't know if you've been in Britain recently, but I drove back from Wales across central England. The amount of flooding and the very few ploughed fields tells me that there's going to be a serious problem with wheat production this year in the UK, which means we're going to be buying it internationally, which we'll be able to do because we're still wealthy enough to do that. But that's going to have consequences for a lot of other people around the world.
Yeah, and if it's flooding in the UK, it's wildfires in Australia,
Yeah,
it's hurricanes in the Caribbean,
yeah.
in the Asia Pacific region, typhoons, and the thing is, there's no scenario that says they're going to be less of them. The only scenario says they're going to be more of these and they're going to be more intense.
Yes.
So if I can bring you back to your paper, what
Do.
what your paper, it's okay, it's entertaining to have this discussion with you. What your paper is saying is that with donut economics, it recognizes that there are certain areas where we have boundaries, and we should be respecting those boundaries in tourism, which our current approach, our current policies, our current ways of collecting data, they're not doing this. They're not focusing sufficiently. First of all, they're not focusing on these issues in a systemic way, which is critical because they're interconnected issues. And secondly, they're not high enough up the decision-making factor. Is that a fair analysis of where you're coming from with the Horizon paper?
I think it is. I'd add to that, though, Geoffrey, that part of the problem has been generated by years and years and years. I mean, forever, as far as I can see, judging ministers of tourism and national governments by the number of international arrivals, not thinking much about the domestic tourism economy, which has largely been allowed to run itself, and focusing on volumes rather than yield. We are slowly beginning to see in the UNWTO a movement towards looking at yield, at retained value. But it was very clear when we did the work on pro-port tourism that people were really surprised that we were concerned about that. A part of the problem for that is that we've not really looked at the economic impact other than at the kind of WTTC satellite account level, where what you're doing is just aggregating all of that sector of consumption within the national economy. You're not looking at it. And I had a real run-in with PwC over the way they were doing the work they did for TUI when they were looking at the contribution of hotels in Cyprus to the local economy. And they were doing it using input-output tables, which meant that if one particular hotel manager was working really hard at local sourcing, they still applied the same national input-output tables to what he was doing. So he got no benefit from it. And until we get a lot more sophisticated at looking at the way the books actually work in a hotel, we don't see what the local economic benefit is at all.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And, I can take some guilt for this, for my days at WTTC when
that was a long time ago, Geoffrey. I'll let you off.
Yeah, no, but we first started to look at the economic impact, and I have to say the goal was to demonstrate the size and importance of the sector. And I think WTTC and to latterly UNWTO have done that quite effectively. But what hasn't been done is to look at the other side of the equation, if you like, to say, what is the impact of this from the sustainability viewpoint? And no effort at all at capacity management. And I think, this is the nub of the issue, that people are going to have to increasingly focus on that over the next 3 to 5 years to be able to bring tourism into the same place as the rest of the economy.
What interests me, Geoffrey, and I genuinely do not understand this, that the kind of business development that we've seen when we had the big four in the UK, it's not that long ago, you and I can vaguely remember it, the competition was all about growth. And it was all about reducing prices as much as possible to get the biggest possible volumes. Now, some businesses do operate like that. Other businesses are much more concerned to maintain their margins and to get yield. And if you look, for example, at the Travel Corporation, run out of London to a significant extent, but they never played in that game. They've always been concerned to build a business that would still be making profits in 20, 30 years' time. And that's one of the reasons why, through the Tread Right Foundation and so on, they're one of the more progressive companies. EasyJet, I would say, is going in a similar direction because of its focus on hydrogen-powered aviation. But most businesses are just in the volumes game. And it seems to me that's a very strange way to want to make a living.
I think it's, there's this huge lag because the lobbying process has been successful over the last 10, 15 years. It is now recognized that tourism is a serious sector of the economy. And I think to the point of our exchange here, it can't stay that way unless it gets ahead of the curve on the climate crisis. And it's not ahead of the curve. It talks a good game, but the actual changes that need to be made are the kind of changes which are reflected in your Horizon paper. I'm sorry to bring you back to that, Harold,
No, we must
but
come back to it, Geoffrey. I mean,
I,
part four
I
actually.
do want to have your views on what's needed now. This is my last question to you, really, in a way. What does the travel and tourism sector have to do now to get into the mainstream of change which is required to deal with the climate crisis? And how can the Horizon paper that you've produced help them with this?
Okay, well, there isn't time to go through all the things I've said in the Horizon paper, Geoffrey. People will be switching off. But basically, part four of that Horizon paper talks about each of the limits, as it were, the limits to sustainability, and suggests strategies that can be adopted to overcome them. What I would say is that that doesn't have to conflict with profitability. That actually driving down the environmental impacts of your business may also actually save you money, that local sourcing benefits the local economy, enriches the tourism experiences. And we've seen that done brilliantly in Kerala in particular.
Mhm.
India is an interesting example because at the national level, Modi has challenged the chefs in the five-star hotels to start making all their traditional dishes using millet. And the reason for that is that millet is remarkably both drought and flood resistant. So clearly in Modi's mind is the idea of moving over to using far more millet. Now that is leadership, that decision. And I've tasted a chocolate brownie made of millet, and I'm no expert on chocolate brownies, but it was a very enjoyable experience. So that's the one thing that can be done. The other thing, it seems to me, is to start thinking about increasing the quality of the experience for the tourists by giving them a more meaningful and more connected experience in the destination and having them move around less so that they actually have more of an experience. I was in Florence recently. I must say I wouldn't have gone if I hadn't been there for business. But I was horrified to see the number of people who were just wandering around to get their trophy photograph of themselves alongside a particular internationally recognizable status symbol. And we seem to have gone with travel into the same area as fast fashion, where you just want to be seen wearing the latest craze thing without any appreciation of being in Venice. I'm not sure if some of those, being in Venice or Florence, I'm not sure if some of those people, if I'd asked them, would be sure what city they were in. They were moving through them so fast. And I think the industry needs to think really hard about whether it wants to go in that direction, particularly given what's happened with fast fashion in France, for example, where it's now being very significantly discouraged. And in the UK, something similar seems to be taking shape. I think the reality is that consumers, particularly young consumers, and I talk to Generation Z people, they see travel in a totally different way. They are not going to accept what my parents accepted, and they're not going to accept what I've accepted for much of my life. They're going to want something very different. And the businesses which are still here in 20 years will need to have made those changes.
Harold, I think we've had a fair run through around your lifetime of advancing responsible tourism thinking and responsible tourism action. I think we've covered large parts of the Horizon paper that you produced for the TPCC. And I think actually the views that you and I have are not so far apart. I truly believe this, and I want to thank you for your time today. And I hope we can give a little bit of promotion to the Horizon paper as a result of this. So thank you very much.
Well, maybe in a couple of years, Geoffrey, I should revise the Horizon paper and bring it more up to date, because by then, hopefully, there might be some more chinks of optimism around.
Well, I hope I'm around for a couple of years, Harold, and
You will be, Geoffrey.
I hope you are as well. Thanks a lot. It was
Very
very
kind.
good. Much appreciated.
A pleasure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.